Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We're delighted that so many of you took time out of your day to be here with us. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a wonderful conversation. We're here this afternoon to talk about the new book, The Magnitude of Us, An Educator's Guide to Creating Culturally Responsive Classrooms, recently published by Teachers College Press. So on behalf of Teachers College Press, my name is Emily. Welcome, and we're so glad to have you here. Another warm welcome to our panelists this afternoon. First, we have with us here today the author of the book, Dr. Marlee Bunch. Thank you for being here with us, Marlee, to share your scholarship and research. Marlee Bunch is an interdisciplinary educator with well over a decade of teaching experience. Her experiences teaching at the secondary and post-secondary level have allowed her to write curriculum, mentor teachers, create workshops, and most importantly, support students. She has taught English literature, creative writing, adult education, and composition, and her scholarship seeks to disrupt inequities and illuminate the power of storytelling and history. She is joined this afternoon by Jordan Stempelman, who is the author of 9 books of poetry. He also edits a variety of journals and has hosted a reading series in Kansas City, Missouri since 2011. In addition to his editorial work, Jordan teaches in the liberal arts department at the creative writing program in the Kansas City Art Institute. Jordan Stempelman's poetry is also featured in the book, The Magnitude of Us, one of many luminary poets of our time featured in the book. So thank you, Marlee, for sharing your work with us this afternoon. And thank you, Jordan, for your contributions to the book and for sharing your perspective with us today as well. Let's talk a bit about the book. I know Marlee and Jordan will speak about it in greater detail, talk about the framework and the point of view of the book, but by way of introduction, The Magnitude of Us is a teaching guidebook. It's designed to help educators create culturally responsive classrooms and community responsive pedagogy. Moreover, it's designed to help those teachers navigate emerging best practices to center historically marginalized voices and perspectives in middle, high school, and post-secondary learning spaces. It's inspired by research steeped in oral histories, particularly those of Black women educators. It includes an abundance of user-friendly scaffolding, graphics, lesson plans, and resources for implementation. Really, it's just a very practical, teacher-friendly tool and an excellent book for anyone navigating these issues. If you don't have it, I really hope you'll consider getting a copy because it's a wonderful resource. So let's talk a little bit about how to get that copy. We are doing a giveaway this afternoon, so please stick with us towards the end of the hour, and one of our lucky attendees will receive a copy of the book. For those of you who aren't lucky enough to receive our giveaway copy, we are offering a promo code this afternoon. You can see the details of that right here. So please make note of this. I will also drop these details in the chat. 20% off the book for the next week only for attendees of this webinar. Again, it's a really wonderful resource, so we really hope that you'll all take advantage of this. It's a unique resource for teachers, and we want to get it in the hands of as many teachers as possible. So some final housekeeping here. Let me tell everyone that we are recording. We're going to share a link to that recording with everyone who is registered within a few days. So please look out for that email, and please be sure to share it with anyone who's not with us this afternoon who you think might find it valuable. We will be having a Q&A towards the end of the hour, so please drop all your questions in the Zoom chat panel, and we'll do our best to get to those. And finally, please check us out, Teachers College Press. We have an abundance of resources in teaching methods, teacher education, multicultural and social justice education, culturally relevant pedagogy. We host free webinars like this throughout the year. So please check us out. Go to our website, tcpress.com, follow us on social media, consider signing up for our email newsletter. We have a very active newsletter program. All these resources are free, tcpress.com. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists this afternoon. Please welcome Marlee Bunch.
Hello. Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to all of you who are taking your time out today to attend. I want to just quickly offer some thanks to Emily, to all of the TCP staff, Mike M, Mike O, and then I want to give a special thanks to Sarah Jubar, my editor, who is the most incredible editor in human, and I just can't thank you enough for the intentionality and care you took throughout this process. It was such a joy to work with you. My name is Dr. Marlee Bunch. I am an author, a scholar, an educator, and a lifelong learner, and I am excited to be in conversation with you this afternoon. I'm going to turn it over to Jordan so he can introduce himself.
Thank you, Marlee. And thank you, Emily, for organizing and hosting this webinar. And thank you, Marlee, for this book, which I'm excited to not only be a part of, but to talk to you about. I mean, it is a book that parts of it that I've used in the classroom and that have been really fruitful for me as an educator. So, about me, I'm a professor in the liberal arts department and creative writing at the Kansas City Art Institute, as Emily mentioned. But I'm a poet, editor of 3 or 4 journals. I've taught though at the primary level. I've been an educator for 25 years now. I just realized that, which is frightening. But I've taught at the elementary level, high school, and now college since 2008. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, Marlee, some questions that I'm hoping that you can answer to illuminate the book for people, those who haven't read it yet. And then I think you might have a couple questions for me as well. You ready?
Good, I'm ready.
All right. Um, First of all, what was your inspiration for the magnitude of us? What was, and what got you working in this direction?
So I had just completed my doctorate at the University of Illinois. And during my time there and for my doctoral research, I interviewed Black female educators who taught pre and post Brown in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And actually, the dates 1954 to 1970. Those dates were important because 1954 was when Brown v. Board occurred, but Hattiesburg, Mississippi did not desegregate until 1970. And so my goal as an educator was to find out more about the history of education. I wanted to know specifically about the interior lives of these incredible women, many of whom I had heard about from my mother, because those educators, some of them had been her mentor. And also, I noticed that there was a gap in all of these great, rich resources we have for teachers. I couldn't find anything that acknowledged or brought in the wealth of knowledge that these past educators who kind of had laid the foundation for education in many ways. And so my goal was to kind of merge past to present and bring their lessons and knowledge into classrooms today alongside my own teaching and the experiences and recommendations from former students.
So in some ways, this was almost like a near forgotten history or an overlooked.
Yeah, I felt like so many of these stories were needed to be unearthed, and so to put them in a book and have their names illuminated, their stories shared, was so important to me because that research was so life-changing for me to bear witness to their stories and hear about these incredible things that they were able to do for students, during Jim Crow segregated South really made me feel a sense of hope and also pride to be connected to that legacy.
That's great. So when it comes to, I mean, this word like culturally responsive teaching, it sounds great. What is it to people? I mean, you're right, because some people might be like, I'm already doing that, but maybe it's a word that gets thrown around, but it really isn't implemented as effectively as it could be. So what exactly do you define culturally responsive teaching to be, and why is it important?
That's a great question. I want to just acknowledge the women who've kind of led the coining of that term. So Gloria Ladson Billings, Geneva Gay, Zaretta Hammond, many of whom have books on TCP. But I wanted to kind of make sense of their work in regards to my own research. So for me, I think culturally responsive teaching includes aligning our practice, our pedagogy, and our curricula. I think they all have to be tied together for it to be effective to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our diverse student populations. And as we're doing that, we're also affirming students and creating learning spaces where students can see themselves and also engage in perspective taking. And so ultimately, we want to see culturally responsive teaching stretch kind of beyond just bringing in a diverse text or creating a diverse lesson. We want it to be continuous, sustainable practice. And so that is in part teacher responsibility and invitation, and also leveraging our students so that in the end we can kind of build these collaborations that help us sustain that work.
So in the book, or to teach, you know, a more to incorporate a more culturally responsive teaching method, you use a framework that it's an acronym, right? And it's called the Unhush framework. Um, what exactly is that? What is that model? Can you give an overview, I guess?
Yeah, so that the I think one of the things that emerged really loudly during my research was how many of the women and their students who I interviewed who talked about how boldly and courageously they worked during this time to create equity in education. We know that there was a lack of resources and um, racial violence, so many things. And one of my participants, Dr. Joyce Ladner, who actually wrote the foreword, when I asked her about this idea of being hushed or unhushed, she said, my generation was never hushed because it wasn't an option. Like lives were on the line, and we knew that if we wanted to create equity in education and voting rights, you had to move boldly and with this assurance that enacting change was the priority. So that's kind of where the term comes from. And then there's 5 principles that the framework kind of leans on. So the UN stands for 2 things. It stands for uniting for collective effort and also naming our positionality. The H stands for histories. The U is the unlearning, and that work that we do as educators and help our students do it. Stories, so the S is bringing in stories in the classroom to build those relationships and collaborative effort. And then finally, H is for the goal of working towards healing, because ultimately that's what we want in all of the spaces that we're at. And so really that framework, when I created it, it was kind of to your point previously, like I think as educators, we hear these terms and you're like, well, yes, I want to do this, but how do I do it? And so I know that teachers are shouldered with so much, and I wanted to create something that could just be a North Star, a blueprint, so that as you're sitting down, revising or assessing existing lessons, as you're going to do the work to create new lessons, or even as you're looking at text to bring into your classroom, this framework kind of helps you walk through, does this have the ingredients of what I need it to be in order to create culturally responsive learning?
No, and I think one thing you do really well is it seems like maybe not after each section, but there's always these approachable strategies that you include, whether it's, with poetry, but for each one, and you kind of tag the ways in which people can do that. So I'm wondering for you, and it might be some strategies that you just are thinking of now that might not even be in the book, but what are some of those effective strategies that you've used throughout your teaching career that have really helped implement this? So it can be some examples from the book, or it might be something that you're just thinking about now or after having written the book.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say this is where I leaned heavily on listening to my former students and getting their feedback. I actually um, interviewed and queried many, many, many students and wanted to know if many of them I had like 15 years ago. So I wanted to know what stuck with them all these years as they are now adults. And what did I do? What did we do together in these classroom spaces that impacted their academic growth, but also just their social, emotional, whole person growth. And so I would say some of the things that emerged from that also included things that obviously that I did, but we had lots of Socratic seminars. So I think I worked to create opportunities for students to have dialogue, to engage in inquiry and think through things out loud. Um, I think I did a good job at creating spaces and moments so students could pause and self-reflect. And you see a lot of that in the book. I think self-reflection is a really, really powerful tool. And even if it's 5 minutes, many of my students said just having that 5 minutes during the day in a day that is busy, um, was important for them to kind of think through questions they had, areas of their identity, how their beliefs in different topics that we were talking through. Um, I think I was really good at ignoring myths that sometimes exist about students, whether that's what they look like on paper or maybe what is said from other educators about them. I really wanted to meet them where they were and discover for myself. And then I think building relationships was my superpower in the classroom. I was able to find ways to um, see the best in them and work to help them see the best in themselves.
Yeah, I know one of the things that's hard for a lot of educators, myself included, is giving that space in the classroom where you feel like you have to cover so much ground, especially in a high school classroom where I know, you know, most teachers have 40 minutes to work with students roughly, whereas I have 3 hours. And even in that 3 hours, I feel like, I'm always trying to schedule almost every minute. Whereas and that affects me too when I ask questions and not just saying, here's the question, now let's just sit with this for a while. I think there's this immediacy that like you said can be more disruptive than anything or perhaps maintain that type of immediate response instead of going into a place of contemplation or something.
You know, that's interesting because I think I would say that's one of the lessons you just spoke about that I learned from students was this idea of slowing down and also like taking moments to enjoy learning. Ultimately, as educators, that's what we want for our students to experience. But yes, I think there's the timetable that we're always so worried about. And so I got really good at just kind of going with the flow. And as long as I saw meaningful learning happening, I was okay extending a lesson or letting students grapple with something for longer than maybe they should. Um, and ultimately, I think, again, that fed into building their academic knowledge, but also just their autonomy to know that they were such an integral part of the learning we were doing together.
Hmm. I guess another question I have to go back to the research component for this book, because you mentioned a lot of the research went into speaking with specifically um, Black female educators from Hattiesburg or around that area. Um, so I'd love to hear some of those takeaways that those women shared with you. Um, and then adjacent to that would be, I know that there's a chapter in the book that includes feedback and insights from your former students. And so I'd love to hear you speak briefly about the importance of including this in your book. And you kind of addressed that a little bit, but maybe some of the things that they shared with you that were unexpected as well.
Yeah, that's great. I will start with kind of the lessons that I think I took away from the women and their students who I interviewed. And I'd love to just share some of their names again to kind of bring in how important their stories and work are. So, my oldest participant was 99 years old, and her name is Mrs. Ellie Damer. Dahmer, for anyone who wants to look up her incredible history. She was married to Vernon Damer, who was an incredible civil rights activist for voting rights. And often, when her story has been captured, they ask about the story of her husband, Mr. Damer, who was killed by the KKK. What I wanted to know is she had been an educator in Hattiesburg for nearly 40 years, and I wanted to tap into that. And so some of the women and the lessons that I learned, I think the biggest one was the importance of collaboration. So many participants spoke about SNCC, so Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who we know historically did incredible things for the civil rights movement, and the way in which students worked across racial lines. They worked with, in the community. They did something called bottoms up organizing. So, white students who wanted to be part of the movement would come and actually live in Hattiesburg, live in Mississippi, and in the communities in which they were working with, so that it was a collaborative and collective effort. That to me was like, wow. So the way they talked about collaboration, I think the other thing was the way that they leveraged that sense of collaboration and community. So, for example, one of my participants shared about raising money to buy a mimeograph, a copy machine for one of the schools. Obviously, that was not a resource that Black schools had, but raising money so that teachers could make workbooks for students. They also used mimeograph machines to make what we would call yearbooks, but they referred to them as annuals. These great lengths to make sure that students, even with the lack of resources, got a really solid education. Many of them talked about the importance of the whole child. So again, not only nurturing students academically, but caring for them socially and emotionally. They were doing all of these things that we now have terms for before we had culturally responsive, before we had social emotional learning. They talked about home visits, the importance of spending time with their students' families. My grandmother, who was an educator, would make ice cream, and people in the neighborhood would come and eat, homemade ice cream and talk. And so this sense of community was so powerful and integral to making sure that students were successful. And what's really, I think, interesting about Hattiesburg, Mississippi is despite the poverty, even at the time, despite the lack of resources, 90% of the women I interviewed had master's degrees. So that was like, wow. Think about the great lengths that these women took to continue their education when we know the universities near them were segregated. And so it involved traveling and spending their own money. So I thought it just made me feel so proud. And I think as a teacher, I wish I would have known that sooner. I was doing so many of those things, but I couldn't really name the origins of it. And so to hear teachers then talk about that, despite the hurdles and struggles, made me feel like we can, we're faced with difficult times, but if they were okay, we can be okay. And so again, it gave me that sense of hope.
Yeah, the one thing that you talk about the ice cream, it seems as if these aren't event-based social engagements. They are 24-hour. It's a 24-hour presence, which I think is something that we've lost track of in education, where it's like we clock in, we clock out. We have a parent-teacher conference. We check that off our list, but we're not forming this kind of fluid integration as a form of community, which is something that we've asked, we definitely need. What about with your students there? The second part of that question about that chapter on your students and the feedback and insights that were surprising to you, or maybe the impetus for wanting to include them in the book itself.
Yeah, and before I delve into my students, I want to mention something that I should have and I overlooked it. But when we think about pedagogy and curricula, I think one of the things that really was so important and inspiring was that um, the women worked so hard to make sure that when students left the classroom, not only were they academically prepared, but they were prepared to be civically engaged. There was definitely, they all emphasized this idea of you are teaching your students relevant and what's happening in society now and how can you impact it and be part of that change, right? So students would often graduate and then they would continue their schooling, but they would also become part of SNCC, for example, and help lead marches and protest Dr. Joyce Ladner helped plan the March on Washington, for example. So that idea of merging civic engagement with classroom pedagogy, I think was like, ooh, that's so important and relevant right now. So my students, I think it is so hard to ask your students for feedback because you're dealing with, most of my students were either freshmen or they were seniors. And so when you're dealing with 14-year-old students, especially if you catch them on a day that, you know, they're upset or you gave them a tardy, you're not really sure what feedback you're going to get. But I felt like my students were always so honest and so willing and eager to help me build this classroom community. And so I willingly actually would create like student or teacher feedback forms that I would give them. I would have a lot of one-on-one meetings with them. And sometimes it was hard to listen to, but I think what I learned the most is that partnering with students and giving them an opportunity to help shape their own learning, really who it benefited was me. I credit my students greatly with being the leader and teacher I am because of the lessons and the feedback that they gave me. Um, I think they made me want to be a better teacher. I credit them with being a lifelong learner because of them. And when there was a gap that either they acknowledged that I had, or I realized on my own that I had, like, for example, I did not know at one point how to serve my students who were English language learners. And so going back to school and getting that certification was so important. I didn't know at one point how to serve my students who were gifted learners. And so going and getting a degree in gifted education, that was always, I think my students made me a better human and a better teacher. And before I get emotional about them, I actually want to bring one of my students on. I think including our students in not only our classroom assessment and our assessment of our practice, but listening to their voices is so important. So the students are in this book, obviously, in a chapter, and I want to open this opportunity to let one of my former students, Maya, I had her when she was a freshman, and so if she wants to unmute and just speak to why culturally responsive classrooms are important and what impact did it have on you?
Hello, everyone. I'm Maya. Hope everybody's having a good, happy new year. Like Miss Marley said, I was one of her students back in 2013 all the way to 2017. I went to Raytown High School. I actually did not have a chance to actually get her as an English teacher. I felt like I was a little more special and I had her as a homeroom teacher. And to me, that was a little more better because she didn't grade me on my work. but but I would simply say, to me, the magnitude of us and the reason why we're all here is because to me, the magnitude of us really means building a community. I feel like from what I learned from Dr. Bunch, she really just brought us together to believe that sometimes the superhumans and the people that we see on TV that have superpowers are not what we look like, but it's more so us that are in the classroom together. She was really big on us being together and getting to know one each other. So, of course, sometimes when you go into a classroom, there's lots of cliques in the seating arrangements. Every homeroom, she would make us sit around and meet someone new and learn something about them. But to me, that really had a chance for to me, that really gave me an opportunity to learn more about my classmates other than what they look like or what sports they may play. It allowed us to really just come together as a whole and really push each other to become further and really know that no matter if she or he is yellow, black, blue, we really all still come from the same type of story and type of background. And for me, it also just motivated us to actually work together with one another. I have some notes, I'm sorry, so that's why I'm looking down. But it really pushed us to get to know each other. It was a really one thing I really admired about her the most is she really built an emotional connection with us in the classroom, whether it was about school or at home life. She really let us know that we had a safe place when we entered her room, and we were able to come talk to her about anything, whether it mean college, outside life. It was really a good home at school for me, and it also just really. And I also was a part of her Louder Than a Bomb, which is a poetry team that we had as well. She really pushed me to be a part of that. But hearing some of the stories that everyone had to say really just, it literally sums up her book, which is The Magnitude of Us. And I love that I'm able to really be a witness into watching something from high school to me grow to be something that it is now. And people really get a chance to see what it means and understand that everybody has a magnitude of us environment everywhere from Kansas City to Chicago to Columbia to wherever. And I think this book for me personally really gives people a chance to really grow and to be open-minded when it goes into a room as a student as well as a teacher. She actually motivated me to go into education. I'm actually working at a middle school now as we speak. And some of the things that I really were taught from her really motivated me to be a better listener, a better understanding person when it comes to the kids and their environment, especially the COVID-19 kids, the kids that actually didn't get a chance to go to school as full time as I did. It's really a big social disconnect because it's a lot of phone, 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 phone. And I'm trying to tell them, like, you have to be social outside of your phone. You have to get to know people. You have to get to know your classmates, know your teachers, allow your teachers to get a chance to know you other than you being the one that's tardy or the one that's always late or the one that's good at football but failing in class. So for me, it really just pushed us. She always had great boundaries and high expectations of us, and she was very into what we wanted to be outside of what the community around us wanted us to be. She literally cared about who we wanted to be for who we are. What do you want your future to look like? And even outside of school hours, she really went above and beyond to make sure if you wanted to go here to do this, she would reach out to people that she knew and connect you with them. Sophomore year, you'll be talking to people in college about stuff to really make sure you know that this is what you want to do. I'm going to connect you with someone, talk to them, ask the questions. And if this is not what you want to do, let's put you in another environment to see if that's maybe better for you.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you
You're
for sharing. I'm
Yeah,
so
thank you
proud.
so much.
I love you.
Yeah,
Proud of
that was great. I loved what you said about like a home in the classroom, where that kind of deinstitutionalizes the school, as this space where you feel just out of place or out of sorts or unwelcomed or not yourself. I've got one final question for you, Marlee, and really it's about if you can share just an aspect or two of the book and how you see them, how you see these aspects of the book, the intended to help readers and educators. Um, yeah.
That's a hard question. I feel like there's a lot. Maybe I'll start with just kind of some of the unique things that I'm really proud of. Every chapter in the book is written in a second language, and that's really a way to acknowledge and celebrate language diversity, which sometimes we overlook. So I think that's really beautiful. I love that my students' voices are in the book, and I'm so proud to have their names there. And I think my goal was to create a book that really was a toolkit that someone could pick up and find a resource no matter what stage of teaching they were at, what grade level they taught, or what subject they taught. And I think I accomplished that. And there are lesson plan examples, everything from elementary to college. I think the framework really helps kind of guide teachers into this idea of how do we implement culturally responsive practices, because implementation and then sustaining is so important. There are QR codes that you can scan and hear poets read poetry. So it's both text and oral. It's listening. It's all of the different ways that we learn and acquire information. I'm proud of that. I want to talk about the poets in the book because I am really proud of that as well. I collaborated. It was really for me a collaboration of love, and again, I'm going to credit my students with them teaching me how to be really good at collaboration. So every lesson plan, I worked with a different teacher. I really wanted to illuminate the title and make it the magnitude of us. And so I'm so grateful that Sarah kind of worked with me and was willing to have all of these voices, this myriad of voices, which during the editing process was probably difficult. But I think the end result is it gives voice and perspective and guidance from so many different areas of expertise. So the poetry, you asked me earlier, what's one of the ways I've sustained culturally responsive classrooms? And I would say Maya mentioned it, poetry, 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 poetry. And I know it is an underutilized tool in the classroom. And so I think it's chapter 4 is really my homage to poetry and art and how do you use it in the classroom. Poets like yourself, Claudia Rankin, oh my gosh, Ashley Jones, the poet laureate of Alabama,
Evie
uh,
Shaw.
Evie Shockley, Cole Swenson, Emily Pettit, just these incredible poets who I have admired and used in my classroom all these years is really important. So I actually would love to kind of flip the script a little bit and ask you if you would be willing to maybe speak about how can we use poetry to illuminate and support culturally responsive practices? So that's my first question. And then the second part of that, I think there's so much fear around teaching poetry. And I remember feeling that fear. And your advice to me at the time was like, just you got to just start, right? You just got to start. But maybe some concrete advice for someone who maybe even an educator who might say, I don't really like poetry. So those two questions, I would love if you'd speak to that for a minute, because I think that's a really special and important chapter.
Well, let me start with that. I didn't like poetry for years. I didn't, it seduced me. It found my way in, and what's interesting about it was it found its way in when I was writing. I think I wrote my first poem after a breakup in high school, and it was all me, me, me. And that wasn't sustainable because that was dull. And then I started reading other poets, and I started to read into this kind of weird language, and it became more and more of a collection of voices. Uh, I always have my students. So let me just go back and talk about, your first question, which is how is poetry aid a culturally responsive classroom or cultural responsive pedagogy. And I would say one of the things that I always do with my students, so I teach a workshop in the fall or in the spring, and it's called Poetry Studio. And so at the Art Institute, we don't have a tiered system of beginning, intermediate, and advanced. So I have students in the class who've never written a poem before, who are maybe just taking the class because they need a credit. And then I have creative writing majors who are taking the class as well. But regardless, I have them read Audre Lorde's essay, uh, Poems Are Not Luxuries. And
Mm.
because what she says at the beginning of that essay is the quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has this direct effect on how we live and how we enact change in our lives. And so that I think is a really important statement. The idea that poetry is this language that we all can use for necessity,
Mm.
whereas most of the time when we use language, we're using it for transaction. I need this, I need that, I want this, I want that. But there's also this necessity in discovering how to bring the inside out to connect with another
Yeah,
human being, and then
yeah,
and then you bring their once inside into you. And
yeah. And
it's
that's the goal of culturally responsive anything. It's
that's
the
it.
exchange of humanness,
Right.
you know. Yeah,
So if you can find this way in which, you know, we replace forms of ignorance, we replace these forms of caricature with complexity, with specificity, then we can be entangled with one another in a positive way, and I like that word entanglement or integration or whatever it may be. And poetry is the place I think where we can all come to it saying, I don't know, where we can all unlearn that feeling that we all have when we don't know something, which is to get defensive or to shy away from it, or, you know, and that's where an educator takes the lead. So I love bringing, I always tell my students, I said, we're going to read some weird things. You know, we're going to read some things that I don't know exactly everything that's going on here, but let's work together to
Mm,
to figure out the depths of this thing. And in the process, who knows what we'll share with one another, or who knows what we'll kind of bring forward into the space. And so that's one of the things too that I think as an educator when it comes to poetry, and you say this in the book, you say it, you say, I think it's in chapter 4, poetry is beautiful and hard. There are no right answers or codes to crack, and there's no pressure to have all the answers. Good
mhm,
educators say, I don't know everything about this poem, but I like this line because,
mhm.
or this line
Yeah,
reminds me of this. So
yeah.
I one of the other, strategies of just not humility, which I think is really important for any educator to have, is, well, you have to have humility, but you also have to do a lot of work behind the scenes as well,
Mm, yeah.
is to, um, I like to always present whenever I can with present examples of language in poetry.
Mm,
Um, whether they're experimental or narrative or whatever. And then I like to connect these backwards. So for example, if I want to talk to students about the sonnet, I'll bring in Terrence Hayes and I'll bring in Wanda Coleman and I'll bring in Ted Berrigan, but then I'm going to go backwards to Petrarch, or I'm going to go backwards into something else. Or if I'm doing sound heavy poetry with Tracy Morris or Amiri Baraka, I'm going to go backwards to Gertrude Stein. But I like to start there so they can hear the mechanisms of language and just the stories. I mean, there's no new stories to tell, and I think this is something that Audre Lorde says at the end of her essay. There's only new ways to recapture that feeling, and I think that's something that language does really well in poetry. But one of the other things I want to say outside of poetry, in the format, the framework that you use in Hush, and I tried this in the classroom recently, was I teach in the fall first year students, and it's like a hybrid of composition and rhetoric. And I have them take a morality questionnaire by Jonathan Haidt. And there's a lesson, I think you included it in the book, right?
yeah,
Where,
yeah, yeah. That's the one we
right?
worked on. Yeah.
So where students basically score their morality. And really what it tells you, and the data supports this, is students who score in a two-channel morality will tend to be more liberal, and students who score in a 3 or 4 channel tend to be more conservative. And it's amazing to see these kids realize that the person next to them might be more conservative, quote unquote, or more liberal. And instead of getting
Mm,
into politics with them, I use your framework. And I say, okay, I want you to take, let's say, if you scored very high on the morality scale of purity and sanctity, just tell the other person one story why you
mm,
scored high on this or why you scored low on this, and share those stories with one another. And once you open the gateway to story, which opens the gateway to vulnerability,
yeah.
you see the person across from you, not, as a stranger, but you see them as a human being. And that's what I think poetry does too. I think poetry is something that's really good about getting us out, unlearning these habits of language so we can
Mm.
actually speak to one another and share our stories.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do think for educators who have never used poetry, I forgot that there's actually advice and guidance from some
Right.
more credible poets in the book. And I can't remember who it was, it might be Paul Hoover, but he talks about poetry is so great because it does this idea of inquiry that we really want, and we know it aligns with every teaching standard, right? How do we build analysis and build inquiry? And poetry is not immediate, and so it really builds that ability to do that. And I saw it in my students. Maya mentioned um, they started to write poetry, and at the end they were performing poems they had made, which was pretty cool. So thank you again for the work you do and the beautiful poems and art that you.
No, thank you for this book. And the last thing I was gonna say really quick is poetry is about play as well. It's about play. So it looks
Yeah.
serious sometimes, but it's about play.
Yeah. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Emily for the sake of time. I want to make sure that we acknowledge any questions or comments from our incredible audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a few questions that have come in and some that were submitted ahead of time. But as we're speaking, please, I encourage everyone to continue putting your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them. To start off, I want to ask a question that an attendee submitted beforehand. These kinds of questions get asked a lot in kind of culturally responsive spaces, I think. Two-part question, really. The attendee asked, how far have we actually come along? And particularly with your historical lens, Marlee, I would really love to hear, your thoughts on that. But then the second part of that question, our political environment, there's been a lot of pushback on this kind of work, in recent days. And so how far have we come along, and also what does the future hold?
That's a really tough question. I've asked that question of my mentor, Dr. Christopher Spann, and my other mentors at U of I. I think we've grappled with that. I think Dr. Lee's on here, but I think my participants would say we haven't come far enough. And I think many would argue that we've taken steps backwards, which I think is why I was so interested in learning their approach to inequitable circumstances in education then, because I saw so many similarities that I think we're faced with now. And I think one of the things participants would say, if I'm hearing their voices, would be we are not maybe leveraging collaboration and coalitions in the way that we should, could. I think there's so many opportunities for that. And I think a lot about Vanessa Siddle Walker's work. If anyone, if you haven't read it, that's a great resource. She's amazing. And she talks a lot about the institutions that Black educators were able to build, and kind of what we would now call affinity groups. And I think we need to find ways to get back to that collaborative work. This current political environment that we're in, and book banning, resegregation of schools. I saw some data recently that said schools are just as segregated today as they were in the 1960s. And I think that that's about policy change. That's about voting in your school board elections, which we often overlook. That's about voting in every election. I think that's about parents and teachers, again, I think we've lost some of that, right? Parents and teachers being in a collaborative space. I think we've moved a little bit away from that. But I think that storytelling and centering our humanness, our beautiful differences, but also the ways in which we are similar, that we can support one another. And I see someone mention about Native American storytelling. It's like, yes, that is why I included that in the framework, because I think it is so critical. And I think that's one of the small steps we can take, in addition to all the bigger things that I kind of mentioned with policy changes and voting, that will help kind of move that needle and honor the work that's been done before us.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think teachers are really good about being creative and subversive and finding ways to, again, tell, find ways into the truth, or find ways into the complexity of situations. So I know, if I'm reading a poem by the poet Brandon Shimoda, or let's say I'm teaching a U.S. history class on World War II. I can integrate a Brandon Shimoda poem or an excerpt from his work to talk about Japanese internment at the time. Not to, again, form a caricature of World War II, but to show the layers and the consequences and the ramifications of all these different mechanisms that were happening at once.
Great, great. Thank you so much. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We had a question from an audience member, Robert, before he had to leave, and we've just received another question from Barbara. Barbara asks where to find multicultural and multiracial guidance for early childhood and elementary. Robert's question was also about doing this work in elementary setting. And Marlee, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe your experience is secondary and post-secondary, as is covered in the book. Um, I'm not sure about your background as much, Jordan, but are either of you aware of resources like this? Is there anything you would recommend for starting this work at a younger age?
Yeah, I think the magnitude of us does have, I think there are aspects of it that are applicable to elementary. I partnered with an incredible educator who teaches elementary in Chicago Public Schools. Her name is Amber. And I think that's a starting place. And I need to do some research, but I feel like any good resource, any good teaching practice can be modified and applied across the board. So again, I would say anything that helps students access creative thinking. So again, bringing in the arts. I think anything that helps young students start to think about history. And I think about some great picture books. Derek Barnes is a phenomenal author who writes really amazing, diverse books. There's an organization called We Need More Diverse Books that's amazing. I would also say Facing History. They're one of my favorite resources, and they have resources across all grade levels. So I would say start with Facing History. We Need More Diverse Books, and see if the magnitude of us can maybe offer starting place.
Great. We have another question now that's just come in from Mary. She says, I never knew poetry as a pedagogical technique. Does poetry cut across teaching science courses like chemistry? And how can a teacher integrate poetry in inquiry-based science teaching? This kind of pairs with a question that we received before the event about how to make a culturally responsive classroom that is also like a rigorous learning environment. I mean, I think some of what Jordan was discussing with poetry and what we've been discussing all along about culturally responsive approaches, I think often those are kind of maligned as, or sometimes maligned as not rigorous, not essential. You know, how do you answer those kinds of critiques?
I'm going to
Yeah.
let Jordan take the poetry one. I want to just speak to the rigor one. Um, I remember there was a moment that a teacher said to me, wow, you had the highest EOC scores out of all the English teachers, but you do so much creative things in your classroom. And I was like, and that's why I had the highest ELC scores. I think anytime we are allowing students, again, Goldie Muhammad does such a great job about talking about joy in the classroom. But I think anytime we are getting students invested in learning, asking them to discuss, to analyze, to walk through inquiry, those are all post-secondary skills. Those are skills. We did a lot of research-based things. Those are all college prep skills that I think, because they're creative, sometimes, as you mentioned, they are deemed as not rigorous. But I think the rigor comes into the questions we ask and the way in which we get students to grapple with different perspectives. That I've had some of the most difficult and rigorous conversations about race, about socioeconomics, and I've had it with 14-year-olds. And so I think it's in the inquiry piece and that analysis piece and getting them to think broadly and then very specifically. And Jordan, I'm going to let you answer the poetry one.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think would be really interesting to have in poetry integrated into a science class. I mean, there's this new book called what is it? It's reading and writing poetry forensically, I think is what it's called, by Paisley Rekdal. And it's this kind of, close analysis breakdown, almost like scientifically, what's going on in the poem, breaking down all the forms of language or all the forms of, but you can also do that and apply it with a work like Brian Tier's Doomstead Days, which is thinking about climate and climate change and the toxins. In the soil and all of that. I think there's ways in which, again, poetry by its very nature, if you go back to the modernists, they were looking at a permeable membrane, essentially, of history, of science, of language, of myth. Everything can kind of move into poetry and out of poetry. It's that flexible of a discipline. And so I think that's, yep, that's it right there. Real toad imaginary gardens. But anyway, I think that's something that I think is really helpful to know that poetry is big enough to allow scientific inquiry, historical inquiry, uh, you know, cultural inquiry, etc. And it can exist line by line. So it removes forms of hierarchy as well.
Great, thank you so much. Before we get too close to 2:30, maybe we can go ahead and do the giveaway at this point, announce the winner. Marlee, do you want to handle that?
Yes, I would love to. The winner for the book giveaway is, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Van Guinez.
Thank you so much. That was the attendee actually who gave us that wonderful comment about Native American storytelling. So thank you for being here, Vanjie, and I'll reach out to you for your contact info. Maybe very briefly, we can do one more question. This one also came in before the event from an attendee, and they were saying that they wanted to learn about tools to empower our students to take risks to keep their voices heard. You know, and I don't know what this attendee meant by risk, but it did remind me of what you were saying, Marlee, about Joyce Ladner and not having the choice to be unhushed, and like another generation kind of had their lives on the line in a different way. What does this work look like for students now, and you know what's that been like in your experience in terms of them bringing it into their everyday civic engagement?
Yeah, I can actually speak to that. I wish Maya knows as well, but I would always encourage students go to attend school board meetings. I would attend many of those meetings with students. So I think that's one thing. Making sure this might sound maybe not impactful, but I think it was making sure students had a library card. I had the local librarian come into one of my classrooms and sign everybody up for a library card so they had access to books and resources that they might not have otherwise. And I would always encourage my students to examine their school handbook and the policies that existed in their schools. So I think that's incredibly important, and finding most schools or cities now have things like Black student unions or organizations that help kind of elevate student voice. And so getting involved in things outside of your school to, again, put you in spaces and places where you can learn and connect with people who aren't in your immediate surroundings, I think is another tool that I would say. But I think the biggest one is being actively using your voice in school, and whether that is through a poetry group or whether that is through uh, again, advocating for policy change. Students are so bold, and I'm so in awe watching them do the work that they do. I think if with a good mentor and leader like all of us, I think they have the ability to raise their voices and do things that we as educators maybe can't. And so I have always said to my students, your voice is more powerful than mine, so use it.
Jordan, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think that's really great advice. And I think, again, the one thing that always creates risk is admitting you don't know something, admitting that you have the capacity to learn more about that as well, the ability to go out and look and dig deeper. That's what I've always loved about teaching. And Marlee mentioned this. I've always loved that I'm coming in just a little further down the road than the students, and I want them to catch up to me, and then we go forward together. That's ideally what I try to do as an educator. So, but
That's the magnitude of us. You just said it, Jordan. That's in your poet brain. It's like, that's it. You said it.
What a perfect note to end on, because we are at time here. So thank you so much, Marlee and Jordan, for sharing your insights. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our audience for being here and for all of your wonderful questions. And please do look out for that recording in the next few days, and please take advantage of the discount code. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much, Emily.
thank you. Thank you.